From Jake Paul tucking his tail after fighting the legendary Nate Diaz to CM Punk realizing that he can't script his way into an MMA belt, here are some of the biggest mismatches in the world of combat sports. Starting off with the recently announced Jake Paul vs. Nate Diaz fight. After tasting his first defeat at the hands of Tommy Fury, an actual boxer, and not some retired UFC punching bag, Jake has reset his focus on fighting MMA fighters with no experience in boxing, namely Nate Diaz. Despite the fact that Diaz has a wealth of experience in combat sports and is widely regarded as a skilled fighter, the reality is that he is not a professional boxer, and therefore is not necessarily a better boxer than Jake Paul. Diaz's experience is in MMA, where he is able to use a range of techniques, including grappling and kicks, whereas boxing is a much more limited discipline. Jake, on the other hand, has been training specifically for boxing, and while his opponents have been less experienced than Diaz, he still has a level of skill and power that cannot be dismissed. So he does have punching power enough to knock out Ben Askren. But of course, the fact that Paul hasn't won any professional boxers means that he still has a lot to prove in the ring. No matter the controversy though, I know I'm still going to be watching to see how everything pans out. Moving on to fights that have already taken place, there's Floyd Mayweather versus Tenshin Nasukawa. Mr. Money is a man who loves a challenge. However, there was one particular event that took his willingness to step out of his comfort zone to a whole new level. In Japan, Mayweather was offered a boatload of cash to face off against Nasukawa, an undefeated kickboxing champion. At first glance, this might seem like a fairly even matchup. After all, the guy was an undefeated champion in his own right, but there was a catch. This was a boxing match. This meant that Tenshin wasn't allowed to use any of his kickboxing skills, and boy did that catch up with him quickly. Mayweather came out swinging and landed blow after blow on the poor fighter. Within seconds, Tenshin was knocked down not once, not twice, but 3 times in the first round.
He's barely throwing anything behind these punches, and they're landing flush.
Nasukawa was doing everything he possibly can, and Mayweather drops him again! The speed of Money Mayweather.
It was an absolute beatdown. The Japanese corner threw in the towel after just over 2 minutes of the first round, putting an end to Tenshin's suffering. But let's be real, this was a ridiculous mismatch from the start. There was no way the match was going to end in his favor. But hey, credit where credit's due. Mayweather did manage to floor the guy 3 times in 2 minutes, so he gets a pass from my end. Moving on though, since I've already mentioned it, let's take a look at Money Man's fight against Logan as well. It looks like the elder Paul brother also has a losing streak against pro boxers. But hey, at least he's not the one ducking KSI. The much-hyped fight between these two was one for the ages. And by one for the ages, I mean one of the biggest mismatches in recent boxing history. Let's start with the basics. At the time of the fight, Logan had a whopping 35-pound weight advantage over Mayweather. On top of that, he was 6 inches taller as well. So it's safe to say that Paul had the size advantage going into this one.
Fans, the ref is trying valiantly to bring it up. Businessman.
But as we all know, size isn't everything. It's how you put it to use that matters, especially when you're up against one of the greatest boxers of all time. Mayweather had a perfect record of 50-0 coming into the fight. In contrast, Logan had exactly 1 professional fight under his belt, a loss to fellow YouTuber KSI. Despite the obvious mismatch in skill level, Logan actually managed to make it through all 8 rounds. Sure, he didn't exactly look like he was going to win the fight at any point, but hey, he didn't get knocked out 3 times in a single round either. Still, Mayweather obviously wasn't exactly going all out in this fight. Pretty much everyone felt that the boxing superstar was only in it for the money. And who can blame him? The guy has nothing left to prove. And he knew that a fight against Logan would bring in a massive payday. I can't diss a guy for chasing that bag, but I sure can diss James Toney in his fight with Randy Couture. So far, it's just been boxers thrashing MMA fighters. But you'll be happy knowing it's the same story for the opposite. The UFC isn't exactly known for its crossover events, but Toney was determined to prove that he could hold his own against a UFC fighter. And who better to take on than Couture, a seasoned veteran who had already beaten some of the biggest names in the business. Unfortunately for Toney, things didn't go quite as planned. Couture wasted no time in taking the boxer to the ground, where he quickly found himself in trouble. Before he knew it, Toney was caught in an arm triangle, and the fight was over in just 3 minutes and 19 seconds. To be fair, it's it's not entirely Tony's fault that the fight was such a mismatch. He was a world-class boxer, but he had absolutely no experience when it came to the ground game. And in the UFC, that's kind of a big deal. In the end, the fight was a bit of a joke, but let's not forget that it was also a lesson that sometimes it's better to stick with what you know. Unless, of course, you're willing to put in the time and effort to learn a new sport. Better safe than humiliated. Unfortunately for Sage Northcutt, though, safety wasn't exactly a concern when he signed on to fight Cosmo Alexander. What do you get when you put a budding MMA fighter against his debut match? Against a reigning champ. You get a mismatch, a devastating one. Northcutt was making waves in the UFC as a young prospect, but then one championship came along and decided they wanted to show the world that their fighters were better than those in the UFC. And what better way to do that than by signing Northcutt to a fight against one of their own? The only problem? They gave Northcutt a former kickboxing champion who was 7-1 in his MMA career. And so, on that fateful day back in 2019, Northcutt stepped into the cage against his opponent, hoping to prove his worth, but it was not to be. Just 29 seconds into the fight, Alexander landed a devastating right hand that sent Northcutt crashing to the ground unconscious.
Congratulations!
You go up against a 7-time Muay Thai world kickboxing champion who knows how to strike like that. You leave yourself open. You are going to the land of Nod. Cosmo Alexander came out.
But that wasn't even the worst part. In the process of knocking out Northcutt, Alexander managed to cause 8 fractures in his face. That's right, 8. And those injuries were so severe that Northcutt hasn't been able to compete since. One literally ended his career for the tiniest amount of clout. Tragic, but still not as tragic as CM Punk versus Mickey Gall. Punk, the former wrestler, was loved by fans all over the world, but a fallout with Vince McMahon meant that he had to leave his wrestling days behind and try something new. And what better way to do that than by stepping into the cage in the UFC? After 2 long years of training in mixed martial arts, Punk finally believed he was ready for his debut fight against Gall. But little did he know, he was in for a rude awakening. Gall completely dismantled Punk, making him look like a complete amateur. And just when Punk thought it couldn't get any worse, Gall submitted him in just 2 minutes and 14 seconds. But despite this devastating loss, Punk was determined to come back stronger than ever. And so he waited almost another 2 years before stepping back into the octagon for his second fight. Unfortunately, things didn't go much better for Punk the second time around. He managed to go the distance, but he ultimately lost via unanimous decision. However, there is a silver lining to this story. Despite losing the fight, it was later ruled a no contest after Mike Jackson, his opponent, tested positive for marijuana. So in a way, Punk can still hold his head high, knowing that he technically never lost that fight. Anyway, that's all for the biggest mismatches in fighting history.